It is mid-afternoon on April 4th, 1977 in Huntsville, Alabama. Around its airport terminal, everything is following the normal routine, with bags, carts rolling over the wet pavement, passengers hustling through the terminal, and a tug idling impatiently in front of the nose gear of a humble DC-9, which is getting ready to depart. Rain has already started falling, and the sky shows that flat and washed out look that it gets when thunderstorms are nearby. But beyond the airport area, something is now brewing. Across Alabama and Georgia, the afternoon weather is about to develop into something truly violent, and the pilots of Southern Airways Flight 242 are about to find this out the hard way. Flight 242 arrived to Huntsville after a brief hop from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and was now preparing for a very quick turnaround. The coming flight was one of those legs that on paper didn't look very complicated at all. It was supposed to be just a short hop from Huntsville over to Atlanta, and it was planned to last only about 25 minutes or so. The planned cruise altitude was therefore also quite low, only 17,000 feet, and the flight's routing ran straight from the Huntsville departure towards a VOR beacon called Rome, which would then lead them in towards Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. In an operation built around quick flights and tight schedules, this flight was pretty standard for Southern Airways though. One more turnaround in a day full of similar ones, where the airplane arrived, swapped passengers, and was then expected to move again as soon as possible. And that pace was exactly what defined this stop in Huntsville. The DC-9 would only be at the gate for around 10 minutes, with passengers getting off, getting on, bags shifted, paperwork quickly updated, and then closing the doors. So the crew therefore had to compress their checks and procedures into a time span allowing only things that were strictly required. The two pilots in the cockpit were also running on the edge of their rest limits and now had to skip lunch after having been on duty for over 7 hours. So instead, they now used what few minutes they had to set up the cockpit, conduct takeoff and en route briefings, and build a mental model of the short flight that they had ahead of them. But at Southern Airways, this was pretty much standard practice. The captain, who was 54 years old at the time, had logged around 19,000 total hours, including roughly 3,200 hours on the DC-9. And his first officer, who was 34 years old, had around 3,900 hours. But he was much less experienced on the type, with only around 235 hours on it so far. Joining them for this flight would be 81 passengers as well as 2 cabin crew, bringing the total number of souls on board up to 85. The aircraft that they would soon be operating was a shiny McDonnell Douglas DC-9-31 with registration November 1335 uniform, and it was powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney JT8 Delta 7 Alpha engines, who will soon play a major role in this story. Now, as the pilots were getting ready, the weather outside was slowly starting to turn to the worse. By time 1533, the airport was reporting thunderstorms and moderate rain showers with a broken ceiling of around 800 feet and with winds blowing at about 16 knots. Now, these were still okay conditions for the upcoming flight as long as the pilots made sure to stay clear of those thunderstorms. I have actually flown in very similar weather myself many times, and when you face weather like this, as long as you have the correct weather information and stay vigilant, it should be relatively easy to manage. But the problem on this day wasn't actually the weather at Huntsville Airport itself. No, it would instead be the convective system that was evolving quickly across the surrounding region and who was about to turn into something truly violent. At the time Flight 242 was getting ready for departure, severe weather conditions were already being observed across the region, and they were worsening quickly. Over the course of the afternoon, roughly 20 tornadoes had been confirmed to have touched down across Alabama and Georgia, and one had even been reported near Rome, Georgia, right on Flight 242's planned route. Now, none of that had happened suddenly or in a way that nobody could have predicted. The National Weather Service had actually begun publicizing the severity of this situation in a series of tornado watches and SIGMETs nearly 3 hours before Flight 242 was to leave Huntsville. In fact, information about this had already been included in the paperwork given to the flight crew before they had left their previous destination, Muscle Shoals. But warnings on paper sometimes doesn't have the same effect on pilots' situational awareness like a real-time weather map does, especially since thunderstorms and the dangers that they come with is often highly localized and can most of the time be easily avoided. Also, back in 1977, there was no cockpit satellite weather or iPads with live weather displays, so getting real-time severe weather information into the cockpit depended on a chain, where weather services had to first disseminate it, the airline had to subscribe to that service, distribute it, and then finally the crew had to actually see and brief it. The National Weather Service's most direct real-time product back then was a narrative warning system called RAWARC, which was a stream of real-time reports and coordination messages intended specifically to keep subscribers aware of rapidly changing weather radar and warning information, which Southern Airways hadn't subscribed to. But they did have access to another system, a radar product routed through the Weather Bureau called the Radar Remote System, or WBRR. And it produced frequent printouts of regional radar displays and then transmitted them by fax to their subscribers. In theory, this gave the airline briefing office something close to a semi-live radar picture, since it was updated often enough that dispatchers could see where the severe weather was forming, intensifying, and how fast it was moving. But when the pilots of Flight 242 stopped in Huntsville, the fax machine at the local Southern Airways office wasn't working. So their dispatchers weren't able to include any of these radar printouts in the information pack that was given to them. Then, 9 minutes before departure, a Southern Airways dispatcher tried to call the National Weather Service office in Athens, Georgia, to get updated information, but the line was busy, so he soon gave up, and instead, the crew were just given the latest METAR observations from some en route airports. This meant that the pilots of Flight 242 were now only equipped with some SIGMETs and reports that were several hours old, as well as a set of weather observations from airports along the route, which provided only snapshots of the conditions at those specific times and locations, which was obviously completely inadequate. And this is probably the part that can be a little bit hard to appreciate from the outside. You see, a flight crew can do everything procedurally correct and still be operating with a dangerously incomplete picture of the actual weather situation, unless they speak up and ask for more information. But a 10-minute turnaround will mean that there will be precious little time to actually evaluate the weather properly, so a tight turnaround like that will increase the chance of something being missed. In any case, with the cabin soon closed up, Flight 242 left the gate and started taxiing out of the tarmac and into the rain. Now the captain would be acting as pilot monitoring and the first officer would be pilot flying for this short leg, and eventually the sleek DC-9 lined up for departure. From the cockpit, the weather ahead looked quite manageable, something that the pilots should be easily able to thread their way through using their weather radar and support from air traffic control. So at time 15:54 local, the DC-9 lifted off the runway at Huntsville and started climbing into the rain. Immediately after takeoff, the captain began monitoring his weather radar, looking for a safe passage forward, but all it showed at that point was rain, so he now told the first officer, "The radar is full of it, take your pick." A moment later, Huntsville Departure Control called up and said, "Southern 242, I'm painting a line of weather which appears to be moderate to possibly heavy precipitation starting about 5 miles ahead." And in response to that, the captain responded, "Okay, we're in the rain right now. It doesn't look much heavier than what we're in right now, does it?" "It's a solid mass. It appears to be a little bit heavier than what you're in right now," responded the controller. And that caused both the pilots to now look a little bit closer at their weather radar. Now the radar on the DC-9 was a fairly basic device with a black and white display called a Bendix RDR-1 Echo. Its screen was only around 5 centimeters across, so it was nothing like the kind of color displays that we have today, which show storms in neat bands of green, yellow and red. Now on the Bendix, precipitation would show up as white static against a black background, and if you wanted any sense of intensity, you had to then change the radar into something called contour mode, With that, the worst precipitation was identified as a dark hole inside the block of white static, creating a white contour surrounding a black void. But the trouble was that those contour holes were the same color as the background. So this meant that a clear gap in the weather and the strongest core of a storm could look at a glance very, very similar. Now, these pilots had experience with this radar and they knew its quirks, but it was still a system that needed to be interpreted instead of just showing the pilots what was going on. And on top of that, the radar also operated in a part of the radio spectrum called the X-band, which covers relatively high frequencies and short wavelengths. And this meant that it was especially vulnerable to a phenomenon known as attenuation. So what's that then? Well, basically this type of weather radar worked by bouncing radio waves off precipitation and then measuring how much of the signal that made it back to the receiver. The stronger the returning signal, the heavier the precipitation. But if the airplane was already in or very near heavy precipitation, well then so much of the signal would be reflected back that the radar waves never reached any precipitation further ahead, causing those areas to read as clear air, but only a faint haze shown on the radar closest to the antenna. And the practical result of this shortcoming was that it could become entirely impossible to determine what was a contour hole, a radar shadow caused by signal attenuation, or what was actually just clear air. It would all just show up as a mess of confusing black and white nonsense on the screen. And what that meant for this story was that as Flight 242 now climbed out of Huntsville through the cloud and rain, the radar picture that they were using was likely being distorted in this way, at exactly the time they needed it the most. Now, because we pilots often fly through dense cloud masses close to precipitation and storms, we have to be able to count on our weather radar. In fact, we wouldn't even dispatch without it unless we are certain that we won't encounter any bad weather en route. But interestingly, that's not how most of us handle our online security, even though we know that there are threats out there. Which is where today's sponsor, NordVPN, steps in. You see, Nord starts by encrypting your connection so that no one can see or track your internet activity, and they are actually the only VPN to be accredited by independent cybersecurity testers. That's because on top of the VPN, Nord also packs a lot of cybersecurity features, like the dark web monitor, which scans the sketchy corners of the web and highlights if your details turns out there as part of a data breach, for example. As well as the Threat Protection Pro, which detects at least 85% of all phishing attempts and blocks them before they even load, meaning that you will never open a dodgy link, a corrupt website or file, because Nord literally won't let you. Right now, you can grab 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan using this QR code or by going to nordvpn.com/pilot. And remember, Nord will always give you a 30-day money-back guarantee so you can try it without feeling any pressure. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the video. In any case, the captain now thanked the controller for the help, but at the same time the confusion about what they actually had ahead of them had not gotten much better. The first officer now added, "I can't read that, it just looked like rain. What do you think? There's a hole?" And the captain answered by saying, "There's a hole right there, that's all I see." Now this search for a hole in a line of severe thunderstorms was actually quite risky business, especially when relying on such a primitive weather radar. There are circumstances where there simply isn't any safe way through a line of thunderstorms, in which case the only thing that you can do is to divert and await the squall line to pass. But of course, that's easy to say. Thunderstorms was and still is a very common occurrence around this area, and these pilots had just flown through this very weather just an hour or so earlier with no real issues. So they likely now figured that it wouldn't be much worse on this leg, and they had a schedule to keep. Get-there-itis is a very powerful thing, and if you combine it with a low cruise altitude, where you're basically constantly inside of clouds, bad weather and a primitive weather radar, you will have quite a dangerous mix, as we will soon see. Now before we continue, it's probably worth stopping here and explain a bit more about the type of weather that this aircraft was now about to pass through. You see, severe thunderstorms isn't just slightly more intense rain showers. No, they are actually completely contained local weather systems built around some very violent vertical motions in the air inside. They can be created by, for example, quickly rising moist air in an unstable air mass, or by the heavy cold air from a cold front, lifting up the warm and moist air in front of it, quickly cooling it down and therefore releasing its energy. You can always recognize these storms by their dark appearance at the base, their extreme heights, which can reach well above most aircraft's maximum service ceilings, and their fuzzy, diffuse white anvils at the top. Now, thunderstorms that are created by local air pockets are often very local, but storms created by cold fronts, like in this case, can be massive and also create something known as squall lines, which are literal walls of cells that can continue for hundreds of miles. And no matter how they are formed, the air inside of these cells is constantly moving up and down, bringing anything inside with it. For an aircraft, this often means severe or even extreme turbulence, where the storm's updrafts and downdrafts causes sharp and unpredictable changes in the vertical wind that can load and unload the wings in seconds. So even if an airplane caught inside of a cell like this stays within its structural limits, its passengers and crew can still be violently thrown into ceilings, bins can open and spill its contents, and anyone who is not properly strapped in can be seriously injured. On top of this, these air movements can also cause rapid airspeed changes, leading to overspeeds or stalls, or in extreme cases even force the aircraft into the ground. And the powerful updrafts often create large hailstones that can crack or shatter outer windshield panes, as well as dent or destroy fragile composite components and leading edges. Now, this type of violent thunderstorms can obviously occur anywhere, but in the southern and central United States, where warm, moisture-rich air from the Gulf of Mexico regularly meets the colder, drier air from the north and west, this often creates exactly the kind of instability needed to power truly extreme storms and squall lines. Now, all of that is, of course, well known, and even back then, pilots were taught to never try and fly through convective cells, but instead give them at least 5 nautical miles of lateral clearance, and ideally 20 miles if possible. Those kind of margins are needed because the dangers from these storms doesn't just end outside of the cloud itself, it can actually throw hazards outward and far beyond its visceral position. Anyway, by time 1557, the weather ahead had stopped looking like a scattered nuisance and instead now looked like a single continuous problem. On the frequency, the controller's tone still stayed calm, but the message changed a bit when he said, "You're in what appears to be about the heaviest part of it now. What are your flight conditions?" The captain answered and explained that they were experiencing light turbulence and what sounded, at least for the moment, like moderate rain. And the controller replied that, based on his radar depiction, it didn't look like it would get any worse. And he then handed them over to the next controller at Memphis Center. Now, in the cockpit, that last statement from the controller was likely interpreted as reassurance. And it also fit the picture that the crew had built up, that the weather ahead was not great, but not terrible either. The captain could now be heard saying, "As long as it doesn't get any heavier, we'll be all right." And the first officer agreed. But as they penetrated deeper into the storm, the captain soon added, "Here we go, hold them, cowboy." And a couple of minutes later he added, "I think we'd better slow it up here in this scrap." To which the first officer replied, "Got you covered." So he now reduced the speed to the turbulence penetration airspeed of 285 knots in an effort to dampen the effects of the turbulence that they were obviously experiencing. A few minutes later, the DC-9 reached its planned cruise altitude of 17,000 feet, but instead of the weather easing off, the cells ahead now just kept building. The captain continued looking down at his radar picture and said, "Looks heavy, nothing's going through that." But remember, on their primitive weather display, the difference between a possible route and a potentially dangerous trap could be only a few pixels of contrast. "That's a hole, isn't it?" the first officer asked, still looking for a possible path forward between the cells. The captain hesitated. It's not showing a hole, is it? By now, the soundscape in the cockpit had also started changing. The moderate rain that had previously sounded like a hiss had now become a roar, and it then changed into something else completely, as the CVR started picking up sharp thuds that definitely didn't sound like water anymore. The captain now ordered the first officer to hand fly at about 285 knots as a hailstorm now started impacting the aircraft with full force. It started as individual thumps and strikes, but it then turned into a continuous hammering that rattled the entire fuselage. So, in only a matter of seconds, the pilots had now moved from watching the weather returns on their weather radar to being fully and truly inside of it. The first officer now asked, "Which way do we go? Cross here or go out? I don't know how we get through here." And unbeknownst to either of them, the storm that they had just flown into was now all around them and also extended tens of thousands of feet above them. So there was no obvious way out. They were trapped. Nevertheless, they now tried forcing through it, because that's what you do when you're still convinced that there is a route out. Modern procedures today give guidance to immediately consider a 180-degree turn to quickly get back out again, whilst also maintaining turbulence penetration speed and increasing the lighting inside of the cockpit in order to counteract any blinding effects from lightning strikes. But that's not what now happened. The captain instead started shouting out fragments of sentences, pointing with words to a picture and a plan that only they could see. "I know, you're just gonna have to go out." And the first officer answered, "Yeah, right across that band." To which the captain returned, "All clear left, approximately right now. I think we can cut across there now." And the first officer replied, "All right, here we go." As they pushed deeper into the storm, the hail intensified again, with hailstones that witnesses later described as the size of tennis balls. And just as they were going through this, air traffic control, who of course had no idea of how bad things were now getting, gave them a new clearance. Southern 242, descend and maintain 14,000. This meant that the flight had already reached its planned top of descent, so the controller was now facilitating their descent down towards Atlanta. In the cabin crew had been able to feel the situation even without having access to any instruments. The sound of hail pelting the aircraft, together with the turbulence and the general darkness inside of the cloud, would have given all of the hints that they needed. So one of the flight attendants now picked up the PA handset and told the passengers to keep their seatbelts fastened, to relax, and that they should be out of this shortly. She was doing that in a very steady and calming voice, effectively doing the job that the pilots weren't in a position to do at that point, keeping the 81 passengers from panicking in a situation that would have been truly scary and was about to get way worse. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, after acknowledging the descent clearance, the pilots pulled the thrust levers back all the way back to idle, and then began to descend through the heart of the precipitation. And before we get to what happens next, I just want to talk a little bit about how jet engines work and the multitude of things that can happen if they start ingesting a lot of water and hail. You see, a jet engine functions by keeping a steady stream of air moving through its core. The compressor stages at the front pull in, squeezes and accelerate the air before it's mixed with fuel in the combustion chamber and then ignited to produce hot, expanding exhaust gases. Those then spins the turbine stages before they escape at the back of the engine, and the turbine in turn powers the compressors and the fan in the front, allowing the engine to effectively sustain itself in a loop. You can think about it like a balloon you have released to let the air flow out, which then keeps filling itself up. Now, the massive fan in the front actually produces the majority of the engine thrust, together with the hot exhaust gases in the back, but it's the core that provides the energy that keeps the whole machine turning. The problem, though, is that when a jet engine starts ingesting large amounts of water and hail, some of the energy that would have normally gone into spinning the turbine gets diverted into changing the state of that water into steam, which lowers the flame temperature in the combustion chamber. So this means that as the water to air ratio rises, the temperatures that the fuel is able to produce decreases, which then in turn decreases the effect of the expanding gases driving the turbines. So given a constant thrust setting, as the rain gets more intense, the engine will also produce less compressor pressure, less fan speed and less thrust. Now, this is normally very manageable, and engine makers like Pratt & Whitney has built in plenty of margin, since obviously flying through rain is to be expected. But if the water ingestion becomes extreme enough, the core can be driven down towards conditions that are below idle thrust, simply because the amount of fuel required to keep it stable under that water load exceeds what the fuel control system can deliver, and therefore also exceeds what the combustion process can sustain. And eventually, if the conditions for stable combustion can't be maintained, well, then the combustion will cease and the engines will simply flame out. That danger then also becomes much worse at lower power settings because of something known as the scoop factor. You see, an engine inlet doesn't just take air in. It actually scoops a column of air proportional to the airplane's forward speed and the inlet's physical size. At higher thrust settings, the engine draws most of that air through the core and bypass ducts because it actually needs it. But at idle thrust, the core airflow is reduced. So the engine then simply doesn't need to, and in fact cannot, swallow the full amount of air that the forward motion of the plane is trying to ram through its inlet. This means that the inlet flow of air will adjust so that some of the air will be deflected around the engine instead of going inside of it, and that works perfectly well for air since it has very low inertia. But water droplets or hailstones have much greater inertia and won't get pushed aside nearly as easily, which means that even as airflow through the core decreases, the amount of water being ingested remains largely the same. Or in other words, there will be much less air, but nearly the same amount of water or hail, leading to a rapidly rising water-to-air ratio. And at the same time, another thing also happens at lower fan speeds that makes this situation even worse. You see, when the fan is spinning fast, it will act like kind of a shield, centrifugating a lot of water outwards into the engine bypass flow. But when it's spinning slower, more of those droplets will make it in between the blades and then continue deeper into the engine. So all of this combined means that in very heavy precipitation, a lower thrust setting that also reduces core airflow also increases the concentration of water reaching the core in the first place. That higher water-to-air ratio then combines with the already lower thrust output at idle, and it becomes much easier to overwhelm the engine's ability to keep running. That's why the most dangerous place to be in a situation like this is not cruising through heavy rain and hail, but instead descending at relatively high forward airspeed with the thrust levers pulled back. Which is exactly what Flight 242 was now doing. Descending through a biblical rain and hailstorm at a high forward airspeed and with the engines at idle. This meant that as Flight 242's engines now ingested more and more water, the turbine rotation speed soon started falling far enough that the engine-driven generators could no longer stay online and continue producing electrical power. And that meant that suddenly the cockpit and cabin lost all normal electrical power. The instrument lighting in the cockpit now went dark, together with several other systems, including the cockpit voice recorder. And in the cabin, the normal lights now suddenly dropped out, so for the passengers it would have felt like the airplane had suddenly been switched off mid-air. And for the pilots up in the front, the total loss of electrical power whilst in the middle of a thunderstorm, fighting against severe hail and turbulence, must have been equally terrifying. Now that blackout lasted for 36 seconds, and when the power came back, it likely did so because the thrust levers had been pushed forward enough to bring the generators back into the working range. When the cockpit voice recorder came back online, the first thing that it captured was the first officer calling out, "Got it back! Got it back!" During that blackout, the radios had also gone dead, and air traffic control had tried several times to call them. Only now, on the fifth attempt, did they get through, and controller proceeded with a request for the flight to climb back from 14,000 feet up to 15,000 feet in order to provide separation from some other traffic in the area. The captain quickly acknowledged this and told the controller that they were trying to get it up there. Meanwhile, hail continued to smash into the windscreen, and soon spider webs of cracks began to form on its outer pane, making it almost impossible to see through. But worse, what no one knew at this point was that inside of the engines, the delicate balance of temperatures and pressures was now changing, and not in a good way. You see, the high-pressure compressor stages operate within a specific range of conditions, defined on one hand by airflow mass and on the other by the pressure ratio. That is, the pressure at the back end of the compressor divided by the pressure at the front. The more lopsided this ratio gets, the closer the engine will get to an imaginary boundary called the surge line, which is the point at which the smooth front-to-back airflow through the core collapses. And what does that mean then? Well, basically, the evaporated water will cool the air as it exits the high-pressure compressor and enters the combustion chamber. And as that cooled flow loses energy, it also slows down and begins to stack up instead of moving cleanly backwards. This then in turn causes an increase in pressure near the back end of the high-pressure compressor, leading to a higher pressure ratio. And when that ratio exceeds the surge line, air will begin forcing its way forward, seeking equilibrium with the lower pressures closer to the inlet. And this reversal of airflow marks the onset of something that we call a compressor surge or compressor stall. Now, these stalls tend to happen in a cyclical, periodic way, where airflow breaks down, reverses, then re-establishes itself and then breaks down again, and with each cycle hammering the engine harder than the last. So by this point, the DC-9's engines were already operating very close to that surge line, as the vast quantity of rain and hail continued to be ingested. Then, during the blackout, the first officer likely increased thrust slightly in response to the decreasing engine RPM, which was ultimately what restored the electrical power. But that also pushed the operating pressure ratio past the surge line, causing the engines to start surging. Now, all pilots are taught to recover from an engine surge by reducing thrust immediately to let the compressor recover, but amid this chaos that they were now in, with the turbulence and their windshield cracking, the pilots seemed to be unaware of the surging as it started. And remember that request from air traffic control to climb? Yeah. When Flight 242 was asked to climb back to 15,000 feet, the first officer advanced the thrust lever at exactly the wrong time. With the engines already surging, the increased fuel flow and suddenly higher thrust demand now took the situation from bad to truly catastrophic. The violence of the surges immediately greatly increased, producing sharp internal pressure spikes that were soon so powerful that they forced the 6-stage blades of the low-pressure compressor forward into the 5th-stage stator vanes. That then caused the blades and the vanes to disintegrate, sending those pieces tumbling deeper into the engine core. And once they reached the high-pressure compressor, the damage multiplied and turned what had started as an unstable airflow problem into a cascading collapse of the entire compressor system. On top of that, with the airflow now disrupted and compressor efficiency degraded, the additional fuel injected when the first officer pushed the thrust levers forward now also caused the temperatures in the engines to rapidly rise, leading to catastrophic overheating. Aluminium components in the compressor sections began to melt, and molten slag was then sprayed through the compressor system. So, all in all, within roughly a minute, both engines now completely failed, with internal damages so severe that restarting them would prove impossible. In the cockpit, the indications of this now came in quick succession. First, it was noticed as an abnormal throttle response, and then the total failure of the left engine. The first officer called out that one engine would not spool properly, while the captain reported to ATC that they had lost an engine. And that was then followed up just moments later of him adding, "The other engine is going too." To which the controller just responded, "Say again?" And to that, the now flustered captain transmitted, "We lost both engines. Get us a vector to a clear area." Now when he heard this, the controller took their latest location and suggested that they should contact Atlanta Approach for vectors to Dobbins Air Force Base that was located just northwest of Metro Atlanta. The first officer mentioned to the captain that that's where he had performed some of his military training, and he also added, "Tell them to give me a vector to Dobbins if they're clear." But just a few seconds later, as the pilots tried desperately to relight at least one of their engines, the battered engine cores slowed down below the threshold needed to power the plane's generators, and the DC-9 again went dark, vanishing from radar and radio contact. And this time, the blackout would last just over 2 minutes, just as the pilots needed vectoring and help the most. This was now turning into a real nightmare, with the pilots facing the total loss of both engines below 15,000 feet inside of a torrential thunderstorm and with a crackulated windshield. The first officer was now hand-flying the plane, and back in those days there was no real procedure or training for responding to a dual-engine failure. That was because up until that point, the possibility of that happening was seen as so remote that it wasn't worth even taking into consideration. But on board Flight 242, that improbable scenario was now very real. And with just minutes before their powerless plane would hit the ground, the pilots had now very little time to prepare for an emergency landing. And to make matters even worse, while they were under total blackout conditions, the crew had performed a 180-degree turn to the west-northwest, taking them away from Atlanta and from Dobbins. Now, because the CVR had stopped recording during that power cut, we will never know for sure why they did this, but it might have been because they saw clear air in that direction and just wanted to try to escape from the storm by any means possible. Regardless of why, this simple action would now have grave consequences, because by the time that they managed to start up the auxiliary power unit and restore electrical power, they were now down to only 7,000 feet, and also pointing away from Dobbins Air Force Base, which was more than 20 miles away. Now, a quick way of calculating how far an airliner will glide without power in a straight line is taking your altitude in thousands of feet and then tripling that to get the distance. So 7,000 feet would give approximately 21 miles, without counting for flap and gear extension, which will then also decrease some of the distance, obviously. So in a case like this, I would just double the altitude instead to get myself better margins. And that would mean that at 7,000 feet, they would be able to glide about 14 to 15 miles, but not 20. In any case, after re-establishing communication with air traffic control, the captain now declared an emergency and asked for vectors towards Dobbins, as well as the latest weather there, still hoping that they could make it. The controller gave them a direct southeast heading towards the base, but with so little altitude left, there was now no way that they were going to reach it. Passing through 5,800 feet and descending fast, the first officer therefore called their traffic control and explained, "All right, listen, we've lost both engines and I can't tell you the implications of this. We only got 2 engines. And how far is Dobbins now?" The controller answered, 19 miles, which must have come as a sobering shock for the pilots. The controller then asked whether they had been able to restart an engine, to which the captain again repeated, "Negative, no engines." Turning to the first officer, he then calmly said, "Just don't stall this thing." And he then started extending their flaps, maybe in order to increase their speed margin to stall. Now, the first officer kept the DC-9 on speed and under control, whilst also trying to get Dobbins' approach charge in front of him as quickly as possible, but both of them soon realized that they couldn't quickly find those charts. So the captain instead asked air traffic control for Dobbins' weather and approach info and was told to stand by. Moments later, now down to just 4,600 feet, the captain again asked for the distance, only to be told that they were still 17 miles out. And with that, the math clearly didn't work. So he now told the controller, "I don't know whether we can make Dobbins or not." The first officer then added, "Ask him if there's anything between here and Dobbins." The captain did so, and at first the Atlanta center controller answered that Dobbins was the nearest airport. But he then remembered the municipal airport in the rural northwest Georgia town of Cartersville. So he informed the pilots that they were currently 10 miles south of Cartersville, and the captain immediately therefore asked for vectors towards it. They were told to fly on a heading of 360, due north, but even 10 miles at this point was still too far away. Tragically, investigators would later discover that Cartersville also wasn't the closest airport. In fact, when they emerged from that blackout, they were well within gliding range of a small general aviation field called Cornelius Moore Airport in Georgia. Its only runway was about 1,200 meters long, which would have been just enough for the lightly fueled DC-9 to get down with maximum braking. But that airport was not on any of the charts carried by the flight crew, and because it was outside of the area covered by Atlanta Center, it wasn't depicted on their radar scopes either. So no one ever realized that it was an option. Anyway, as all of this was going on in the front, back in the cabin, the forward flight attendant had cracked the cockpit door open to ask what was happening, to which the pilot snapped at her to just sit down. She therefore just backed out again, but having seen that the windshield was shattered and all of the chaos inside of the cockpit, she understood that an emergency landing was imminent. So she now began preparing the passengers by explaining how to open the exit doors and how to brace for impact. She also called the flight attendant in the back and began discussing the best way to prep themselves and their passengers for what was to come, even suggesting that they should all take off their shoes so that they wouldn't damage the slides if they had to use them during an evacuation. Now that was actually good thinking and standard procedures at the time, but in this particular case it would come to have some truly negative consequences. The flight attendants also did all of this without being told anything by the flight crew, solely based on their own assessment, which was a great example of professionalism. In any case, as the aircraft descended through 4,000 feet, the pilots realized that a forced off-field landing was now their only option. The captain said that he was picking out a clear field, but the first officer demanded, "Find me a highway." The captain repeated that they should try and take the next clear open field, but this section of Georgia was heavily forested back in 1977, so large fields were quite rare. And the first officer therefore continued to believe that their only option was Georgia State Route 92, a large two-lane highway running through what was then the sleepy rural town of New Hope. The captain pointed to that highway and said, "There's no cars," but when the first officer asked if it was straight, the captain added that it was not. To which the first officer only replied, "Well, we'll have to take it." The captain now called air traffic control one last time to inform them that "We're putting it on the highway, we're down to nothing." And as he did this, he also simultaneously lowered the landing gear. Steeling his nerves, the first officer told himself, "I hope I can do it," and then, I got it. And at one point he even called out a car on the road saying, "I'm going to land right over that guy." With less than 100 feet between Flight 242 and the highway, the first officer continued to encourage himself, and finally, when out of altitude and time, he added, "We're going to do it right here," while the flight attendants could be heard yelling to the passengers in the back to "Bend down and grab your ankles." As the plane descended to just a few feet above the road, both wings began to hit trees, followed by utility poles and power lines. The last words captured on the cockpit voice recorder were recorded at time 1818. Just over 20 minutes after they had left Huntsville, as the first officer shouted out, I got it, followed by a curse from the captain and the horrific sound of the aircraft breaking apart. Both pilots had stomped on their brakes as soon as the landing gear was on the road, but it was too late. Within seconds, the left wing smashed into an embankment and tore off, and the plane then yawed violently to the left, sending the nose careening into a roadside service station, where it sadly then struck and killed several motorists who had stopped to get some fuel. A fireball quickly engulfed that service station, and the plane continued sideways through the front yards of several houses, where huge trees soon ripped the fuselage into 5 pieces. The burning wreckage then finally came to a stop after sliding for nearly 600 meters, leaving a trail of destruction and fire through the center of New Hope. And the destruction of the airframe was so extensive that many passengers had been killed instantly, and even those whose seats had stayed intact had only seconds left to escape the smoke and flames. Some passengers escaped through openings in the broken fuselage sections before heat and smoke made movement impossible, and others were ejected during the breakup. And many of those who escaped did so without shoes on, which made their injuries graver. But the 2 flight attendants did survive, and their cabin briefings were later found to have been one of the few controllable factors that increased the overall survivability of this accident. On the ground, local volunteer responders were quickly on the scene, but the crash had severed utilities and set multiple fires, including that burning service station, which turned the rescue into a race against the heat and time. Around half of the occupants of Flight 242 perished on impact, including both of the pilots, and by the time that it was all over, another 20 had died as a result of the blazing inferno, along with 9 people at the service station. 2 more then passed away in the days and months that followed, bringing the total horrifying death toll to 72, with 22 passengers and crew members surviving. The investigation that followed now had to answer 2 questions. How could a jet airliner lose thrust on both engines in flight, and why was it in the core of a severe thunderstorm in the first place? Now, if you look over here, you will find the answers to both of those questions as explained by the NTSB in the final report, but I also want to mention that there was another hard lesson to be learned here, that highways are not runways. While they might be popular places for troubled airliners to land in Hollywood movies, in real life they're often some of the worst places to do so, and Southern 242 would be the last passenger airliner to ever attempt it, at least up until now. Today's pilots are unlikely to do something similar thanks to vastly better weather information, better knowledge of how engines behave in extreme precipitation, and training on how to actually deal with a dual-engine failure. So as always, this horrible tragedy ended up making aviation safer in many different ways. Now, I hope that you have checked out our new channel, Mentor's Black Box, where my team and I explain accidents and incidents outside of aviation in the same way as we do here. We will be uploading new videos there bi-monthly, so please check it out and subscribe. And when we're speaking about checking things out, just look at some of the love that we've received from our latest episode. Please know that we really appreciate each and every one of your comments, and I read as many of them as I possibly can. Now, if you want to support the work that we continue to do on all of our channels, then consider joining my Patreon crew by scanning this QR code or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. It is super appreciated. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.